Welcome back to the Infinite Restaurant Podcast, where we share stories from the front lines of hospitality. I'm your host, Andrew Cook. Infinite Restaurants is brought to you today by Harbor Food Service. This is part 4 of our 5-part series where we are exploring the consumer or diner's attitude or expectations surrounding restaurants reopening post-COVID-19 shutdown. And joining me today is Mark Brandau. Mark Brandau is a group leader at Datassentials, where they have been producing a twice weekly COVID-19 finger on the pulse reports, and they have been kind enough to slice that data down to the Pacific Northwest so we can get a really good sense of where the attitudes of the people we serve are. Mark, you have been using a term which I like called overt sanitation. I tend to use the term theater, but I think we're talking about the same thing. But because you all do what you do so well, I'm going to lean into your term. Oh my God, where are my manners? Mark, I must have misplaced in between episode 3 and episode 4. Welcome back to the show. I'm really happy you're here. Thank you for sticking around.
Again, thanks for having me. And I think that, I think that your term is great because probably the best people at overt sanitation have a degree of theater, involved in it. And they have, just a little bit of hospitality that goes along with, a what is by definition a more sanitized experience right now.
Yeah, I was acculturated into the industry where this was a common simile, a common allegory towards what we do and helps provide the why behind why we do it the way that we do it. And so theater is just sort of a term that I end up falling back on, and I think it still fits.
Yeah, well, if we think about this as in terms of, set design and props, it's going to be a bigger part of it going forward. And it all goes back to just an abundance of reassurance that this experience is safe. And I think that that's what plays into people's comfort level with reopening.
And we're about to look at some of the data that you provided that reflects that point pretty well, with this exception. I'm looking at a slide now that's titled, "The Pacific Northwest is more split on the question of reopening compared with 62% of Americans thinking that we should take more time." Now, this graph I'm looking at, it's a dead even 50-50. 50% say we should take more time to reopen, and 50% say businesses should be allowed to reopen. Now, on one hand, this seems to be contrary to the general consensus from earlier reports that suggests an abundance of caution. How do you balance those two things out? How does this piece of data inform the rest of the larger data? I want to lean into your data brain, Mark. Help me make this jive with the rest of this report.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me that folks in the Northwest who, for one thing, have been dealing with coronavirus a little bit longer than the rest of the population, and also made the transition to working from home and sheltering in place a little bit better. With that kind of as their baseline, when they answer this question, they perhaps are maybe a little bit more ready to think about what happens after the dealing with the public health crisis. And so, it might also be the case though that they are saying, yeah, places should be reopening, but maybe you go first. Maybe I'll kind of wait and see, but you should definitely be open. And I'll use you, but it might just be delivery or carry out to start out with.
I suppose on one hand, it does apply a certain logic in that our reopening guidelines and rules, they've been rather fuzzy, and they don't make a lot of linear, obvious sense to many people. For instance, it's okay to go hiking in state parks, but you can't go camping, and you would arguably encounter a lot more people on a narrow trail, than you would in a broader campsite. I suppose it's also worth considering that we've handled this pretty well. We reacted quickly. We were ground zero, and we took remarkable measures ahead of a lot of other states and areas of the country, and we were quickly surpassed by some people that maybe acted a little more slowly. So I feel like perhaps there might just be a little more trust in our systems. Mark, what do you think? Do you think that holds water, or do you want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, I think there's more capability too in the Northwest, where a lot of folks have been able to, kind of go work from home and not, experience layoffs and furloughs, at least not as much as the rest of the population based on this sample. Seems to be a higher comfort level. Using digital ordering channels. A lot of the restaurants around there are already set up on it without too much of a transition. So, I think looking at these numbers, and there's a little bit more comfort with reopening. I think that's coming from a position of strength, honestly.
Epic levels of strength. I like that. I'm sorry I cut you off because clearly you're about to mention our epic levels of heroism. But that's okay because we're probably the most humble people in the history of humanity. So let's advance to the next slide. Pacific Northwest guests would judge chains slightly more harshly for reopening soon. This is different from the national average. The question posed is, how would you feel if your favorite chain restaurant opened up for dine-in service the first day it was allowed? Now, before we get into this discussion point, Mark, can you qualify what you mean by a chain?
A chain is any restaurant with 2 or more locations. So we didn't get too finely into is this a single unit of a franchise operator? It's just, do you recognize this brand as a chain?
Okay, that tracks. So we're talking about a recognizable brand name that may have more than one location. We have several of those, as I'm sure many states do.
Yeah, it could be like a Burgerville or something like that.
Okay, well, that's illuminating because what I'm looking at here is 23% respond negative. It's irresponsible. Whereas 45% declare it to be neutral. It wouldn't change how they feel. And 32% feel it's positive. They'd love to see restaurants reopen ASAP. So 77% of the people are pretty much fine with it. And only 23% feel that it's irresponsible. That's probably a pretty indicative data set for just about anything, isn't it?
Right. Right, and the number of people who do see it as a negative, that's not, that's smaller than the number of folks nationally in the Northwest who are, in general, worried about a public health crisis and reopening too soon broadly, undoing the work that's been done.
In the months leading up to this conversation we're having right now, I've been privy to a lot of the data gathering and reports that Datassentials has been producing to help quantify all these different aspects of the coronavirus outbreak. And we don't have time to get into them all, but there was this one slide that really stood out to me, and it was about political affiliations. And it had to do with different trust metrics along the way. And it was remarkable to me just how polar opposite they were, where one went up, the other went down. And we saw that all the way across the board. In fact, I'm going to dig it out and put it into the slide deck that we're going to be displaying on the video version of this interview. As I've mentioned before, the Northwest tends to have quite a diversity in population densities, where we have larger metropolitan areas, which tend to lean more blue as they do, and we have more rural areas that tend to lean more red. Now, we've been advising people throughout our series of interviews that when we look at demographics, we could be using this data to help inform the nuances of our pathway forward. Mark, I wonder if the data that we have for the Pacific Northwest can reflect that in any real way, or we should just take that as sort of an indicative response that we could perhaps use to inform the demographics that we serve.
Sure. So we couldn't slice and dice by political affiliation for all of this report, just because in order to do that, it has to be one of the survey questions, and then you add a crosstab for it. That wasn't part of the survey design here, so we can't get into how all of this shakes out by political ideology. But in general, yeah, we've found that unfortunately, reactions to coronavirus tend to mirror polarization that is kind of prevalent throughout the rest of the country on kind of anything, really. How you feel about most things these days does tend to get influenced by your political ideology. And so, to your point, there are, bluer and redder areas within states, and then some states are obviously going to be more red or blue than other states. In general, there is more comfort with reopening among more generally politically conservative states and metropolitan areas within a state. And it does kind of make this a little bit harder, right? Because, just like the entire country is, a pretty diverse patchwork of places, that's going to cause, different reactions too. So you see it in, openings and closings of dining rooms where, as of last week, I think there were, 10 states fully reopened with no restrictions, and 10 states that were still mostly locked down, and everybody in between, it was kind of varied, when it was 33% capacity or half capacity. And absent, a real top-down set of guidelines, it's going to just make things a lot harder across the country.
Perhaps you can help me scratch a curiosity itch. When I'm looking at two different data sets, for instance, we looked at boomers earlier that had a more elevated level of concern about contracting the coronavirus and playing it more safe. Could we cross-reference that with perhaps a boomer generation member who tends to be more conservative in their political leanings? Would those two things track out, or would they cancel each other out?
I think that they might have heightened concern, and it doesn't always show up though in their behavior, in their avoidant behavior. It's a really nuanced thing that it gets hard to track sometimes. We've seen that boomers are missing more of the social aspect of dining out than other generations are. We talked in an earlier part of this segment where, in the Northwest, people are really missing the food. They can sort of wait on the socialization aspects of getting back into a restaurant, being part of a crowd, reconnecting with people in the dining room. But that effect is a little bit different for boomers. They tend to value that more than Gen Z and millennials do. And so within the data, within this region that we're looking at, it can be different. And so it's just really hard to, tease that out in a talk like this.
All right, I can live with that. I'm just going to have to live with that curiosity itch at the same time. So moving on, now I'm looking at a slide that is titled, Consumers in the Pacific Northwest are slightly more comfortable with dining in. No surprise based on the data we have so far, but here's the question that's been posed. Which of the following do you feel truly comfortable / safe doing? And topping the list is order ahead and go pick up inside. We're quite a ways ahead of the national average. We are dead even on drive-through. We're practically dead even on order ahead for curbside pickup. And then we start to see more variances. So we're less comfortable with delivery. Mark, there's got to be some nuance to the way this was formulated or questions. Could I turn this over to you to give some informed speculation or some interpretation?
Yeah, I think what is important to note here is that while the folks in the Northwest, the small sample, are still a little bit more comfortable than the rest of the country is with dining in, that option of dining in, it's still going to be lower on the list for everybody beneath some of these delivery carryout methods that are right now by necessity most popular during COVID. I think that what it says to me is that once a consumer kind of clears the hurdle of, actually wanting to get out of the house, they will be comfortable for the most part with dining in. But until they get there, you just need to make sure that you are still, staffed up, and that your marketing is still kind of matched up with people tending to go with delivery carryout still.
Yeah, so I want to jump into that cold river, but I want to see what your reaction to it is first.
Sure.
We're on our last slide for this segment, and it's titled, Perhaps This New Normal is Just Normal Already. Like most people, consumers in Washington and Oregon feel the strongest need to support restaurants in their local communities and are getting tired of cooking the same things at home. But they're not necessarily desperate to break out of the house and see other people. Based on other demographics that we've seen, there may be some serious misunderstanding in some boomer households where one spouse is saying to the other, I'm ready to go out and see other people. Perhaps Pacific Northwestians, my term, not yours, have adjusted to quarantine life already and are prepared for what could be a long haul of more social distancing if there's a second wave of COVID and lockdown. The question asked and answered is, once social distancing is eased, what are your top reasons for wanting to visit restaurants and bars again? Now, here's something interesting. Every single one of these line items, these responses, are below the national average, except none of these. Still nervous about restaurants and bars at plus 1.5% of the national average. But that's neither here nor there. This is still ordered in metrics of popularity. So topping the list is, here in the Pacific Northwest, people want to support the restaurants in their community, followed by cabin fever and I'm tired of cooking at home. Mark, I'm going to turn this over to you again. What do the numbers say?
Well, I think, again, this showed up again, and we saw it earlier too, where the top reason is to support restaurants in the community. So what I would take away from this is that people are going to be very, very eager to use your restaurant. It just may not necessarily be inside for a little while. And that has challenges of the way that you staff up and the way that you give people enough hours to, keep their serving jobs, and it'll look different in the kitchen. And I'm sure your managers and expediters are going to be, more concerned about stuff going out the back door than they are into the dining room. So operationally, it's complex. What's good about that though is that it'll still keep you set up for what we just don't know is going to happen. I wish that Datassential had enough tools to call the end of this pandemic. We don't. It could intensify and come back at several points here before we know how to combat it with a vaccine or a treatment. So even if we are getting kind of really out of the woods in terms of the worst that the crisis has been, and for the Northwest that was at the beginning, we're going to need these kind of off-premise strategies and muscles for a lot longer than we might have thought. Consumers, I think, will come around. I would expect that some of these measures of things like cabin fever, needing a change of scenery, even things like wanting to celebrate a special occasion, for some people, that birthday or anniversary might not have come around yet while we're stuck at home. But, if we live through that, then some of these measures might change, or we do need to get out of the house.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mark. And with that, we're going to wrap up this segment of the reopening Part 4 segment of our conversation. And stay tuned, because Part 5 is, now that we've unpacked all of this data and made some informed speculations and comparative nuances, we're going to do a Part 5 where Mark and I are going to summarize and recapitulate a lot of these data points, and now that they can be compared to one another in the mind of you, our listeners. So thank you again, Mark from Datassentials, the premier market research and insight firm that's dedicated to the food service industry. And a continued thank you to our primary sponsor, Harbor Food Service, for helping bring all of this together. I've been your host, Andrew Cook. Thank you for tuning in to Infinite Restaurants, where we bring you stories from the front lines of hospitality.